Hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. We might have some more people coming in. So thank you all so much for coming. We're going to begin with just some basic introductions. While myself and the panelists are introducing ourselves, we'd love to hear from all of you in the chat. So if you want to put your name, pronouns, your role, like if you're a student or a teacher, institution, and location in the chat, that would be great. Trying to send that out in the chat for you as well, but it was working earlier and does not want to work now. Just a brief introduction in the chat would be great. So I'm Cara. I am a research scholar with HRE USA, and I've had the opportunity to coordinate this year's Training as Action series. I am a senior at Albion College in Michigan, studying political science and English, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. So throughout the session, if any of you have any questions or a concern comes up, feel free to let me know. You can also contact Jarwin, who is also helping me tonight. Jarwin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Of course, Cara, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jarwin. I'm an international student here at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. I study human rights and humanitarian policy. And this fall, I'm assisting with HRE USA with the TAAS series, as well as the Human Rights Research Award. So very nice to be here tonight and assist with this module. Thank you so much, and look forward to hear from all of you.
Thank you. Now, panelists, if you want to popcorn to each other and introduce yourselves. Jake, how about you start us off?
Thanks, Cara. Hi, everyone. I'm Jake Skripek. I am a social studies teacher in Manchester, Connecticut. I am a steering committee member on HR USA, and also serve as the co-chair of the National Council for the Social Studies Human Rights Ed community, along with Chris Buckley, who is here tonight, and serve in a variety of other roles as well. Really happy to be here, and I'll pass it over to Chris.
Perfect. Thanks, Jake. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Buckley. I teach social studies and human rights at Brookfield High School in Connecticut. As with Jake, I am the co-chair for the Human Rights Ed community with NCSS. And as also with Jake, work as an educational fellow for UConn with the Human Rights Close to Home initiative. I also work as a lead educator for RFK Human Rights, and just really excited to be here. And I'll pass it to Jenna.
Hi, I'm Jenna. I'm a 12th grader at Brookfield High, and I took Intro to Human Rights with Mr. Buckley last year. Yeah.
Kevin, why don't you go next?
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Kevin Masonette. I'm a sophomore at Fordham University in New York City. I'm studying political science, humanitarian studies, and Spanish, with a particular focus on democracy and civil rights in the United States. And I was honored to be on the previous TAAS misinformation session, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to pass it off to Keith.
Hi, I'm Keith David Wattenpaugh. I'm professor and director of Human Rights Studies at the University of California, Davis. I was the 1921 O'Brien HRE Award winner. And so I'm always very thankful to collaborate with the organization. And I direct two projects of relevance to this, project that's sort of drawing down, which is the Human Rights Studies for 21st Century Californians Education Process project, which I'd love to put a link to. And then the Article 26 Backpack Project, which is a refugee higher education access tool, global tool, which is largely led by University of California students. Who should I bump it to?
I believe that was everyone.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you all again for being here. I'm going to share my screen. We have a couple quick housekeeping items, and then we'll really get into the main content of the discussion. Can everyone see my screen?
Oh, no, I don't see your screen at all.
Oh, you do not?
No.
Your screen is visible on my feed. I'm not sure.
If it's not, please continue. I'm sure
Okay.
it will appear. It will appear.
Okay. So starting with our agenda, we already just did our welcome and introductions. Next, we just have some basic getting started and a group agreement. Then we'll go on to our panel discussion that will take up the majority of our time. And right after that, we'll have an open Q&A. So be thinking of questions during the discussion that you might have for the panelists. After that, we have about 20 minutes to do a breakout room activity, and then we'll kind of be wrapping things up. So first, we just want to kind of set some group expectations. We like using this respect model. We want to make sure everyone is respectful and feels respected in this place. Want to make sure people are responsible and taking charge of your own words and actions, trying to have empathy and really listening to each other and trying to connect. Want to share airtime. So try not to take up too much time, like when you're asking questions or sharing out, but we do still want to hear from you. We really want that participation. We're all here to learn together and from each other. Make sure to bring that enthusiasm. We love seeing all of your energy and optimism in this space. Communication, making sure we're being clear and positive, and again, respectful. We really want this to be a place of trust where we're honest with each other, sharing feelings, and just supporting and encouraging one another. Now, as we're getting started, it might be helpful to have kind of an idea of where everyone is at. So if you want to put in the chat your answers to both of these questions. So on a scale from 1 to 10, how familiar are you with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 29 of that convention, and youth rights and advocacy? And then also on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you in your ability to help support and empower youth? So we'll take a couple minutes, just think that over and put your responses in the chat, please. With 1 being not familiar at all or not confident at all, and 10 being the most confident or familiar. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see as responses come in. I'll try and put these in the chat as well. There we go. was giving me some difficulties putting it there. And welcome everyone who just got on. Happy to see you. Make sure to introduce yourself in the chat as well. So far, we have a pretty kind of broad range, which is expected and great. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll all be feeling a little bit more confident and having a bit more understanding and familiarity with things. So we'll go ahead and get started with our panel discussion. If you haven't put those answers in or introduced yourselves yet in the chat, please do so. So now our first question is, what is the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and what is Article 29? Chris and Jenna, can you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So it's nice to see everybody and welcome. And usually when I do these things, I kind of share that I teach this in a high school course, and I am by no means a CRC scholar, right? So the way I share this is through the lens of how I engage with my students on this. And one of the things that I share with my kids is what a convention is and the difference between some of the the different international relationships that countries have, right? So this isn't a declaration. We talk about like the UDHR and the Declaration of Human Rights. When we talk about the Conventions for the Rights of the Child, this is a legally binding agreement that countries have entered into when it comes to how we define what a child is. And it's a convention that essentially helped to define what a child was, right? A person who is 18 years old or younger, and also define what their relationships became with things like their family, the environments in which they're part, whether or not they can work, things like that. So it helped to, on a global scale, create a standard for all countries as to what a child is, what rights children have, and how they're supposed to be treated, and in kind of the way in which children should be viewed by not only the global community but by the small communities, which are their families. And one of the points I make with my kids is that this is one of the most widely signed conventions in global history, right? So more countries have signed this than any other convention, and that it was, comes into being in 1989, I believe, and it is widely signed, but by few notable countries have not signed it, right? And we're one of them, right? So we have that unique distinction of being really the only significant major country in the world that does not have a signatory as a ratifying signature, right? So, and some of the other folks, maybe as this unfolds, can explain the nuance that I don't want to do all of it all at one time, but we haven't signed it, right? Our UN ambassador has signed it, but our government has not. And I think that's a notable exclusion that I know my class talks about it in a great deal of length, why we haven't signed it, and we certainly can get into that as this unfolds. But we have not signed this international treaty that pretty much every other country in the world, really, with few exceptions, has signed. Jenna, I don't know what else, if you want to add to that.
I don't really have anything else to add on like the definition necessarily of the CRC, but I think it's extremely important to like realize that the US hasn't signed it, because it's honestly, we're one of the most powerful countries in the world, and like, why haven't we signed it? And I mean, it's just, I don't know, something to talk about and like something to be aware of.
Yeah. Things I also talk about with my kids, right, is that what this did is it helped to define the entity of what a child is, right? And that a child has its own, they have their own rights, and that they are not something to be viewed as in some cases, charity case. They don't belong to their parents in the capacity of ownership. They can't be, moved around as if they are commodities that can be passed from one family to another. So part of this, as you kind of unpack the different amendment or different articles of the CRC, it helps to define you know, things that maybe we take for granted in countries or communities in which children are valued, and in other places where they're valued as a monetary item, right? That they, you know, children can bring in value into the home in a different way. So there, I think that's a big part of kind of as we unpack it with kids, and I unpack it with kids about what aspects of the CRC might be different in a place like Brookfield, Connecticut, where we live, where I teach and Jenna lives, and then other places in the world. When you break down the articles, and so kind of specifically for Article 29, part of what we talk about with the CRC is the empowerment of children, that children are significant when it comes to, you know, the ideas and concepts that they have to offer, that children are their own entities and have value. And so the focus of this is about empowering children. And, you know, for the educators and on here, like, these are things that I think as you know, good human rights educators, we know that kids bring so much to the room and so much to our learning. We can learn so much from them, but that is something that I think is not to be taken for granted, and is very specifically enshrined in Article 29, that, you know, kids have value and that they are to be empowered to do kind of great things, so to speak. So yeah, so I'll kind of leave it at that, unless Carrie, you have some others more specific things you want me to unpack, or if any of the other panelists want to add to that.
That's actually a perfect kind of segue into our next question, which is really going to open it up to the whole panel. How does the CRC serve as a tool for youth empowerment?
Cara, I'll weigh in briefly here. I think that, you know, at the end of the day, the CRC is as Chris said, you know, a legally binding document that is signed by many international parties, right? But I talk about this with my students quite a bit. It's one thing to look at a document and to say, yeah, that's great, it's out there and we've signed it, and, you know, good for us. It's another thing to say we're actually going to put it into action and we are going to implement it with fidelity on a local level, on a national level, on a global level. And so I think that's kind of where we have to think about where the rubber hits the road, right? Allowing, particularly in a classroom with like K-12 students, and again, I speak from that kind of perspective, I think demonstrating to students that the CRC represents basic fundamental protections that each and every one of us deserve, particularly those who are under 18. So I always bring this up in my class, like, yeah, there's a protection within the CRC against being kidnapped. Good, like, that's a good thing, right? Like, we should have that in there as a universal basic thing that we all agree upon. Or the protection against being, you know, divided between your family, or having basic safety in your schools. I think these are things that we have to have deeper conversations with our kids about, and really allow them to say, like, hey, how can we take the spirit of the CRC, the aspirational nature behind it, and within our small communities, very, very close to home, take action in implementing these things that are going to defend our basic dignity. And I think that no matter where a student or a young person is coming from, their background, their ideologies, whatever it might be, I think we can agree upon these very core notions of people under 18 deserve dignity, universal dignity, unequivocal, no matter what. And so I think, last thing I'll just say, I think it is not just a talking piece we can use in the classroom. We can really foster a culture of dialogue and action with young people to say, how can we take it a step further? How can we use this as ways in which to change our communities around us?
Garrett,
I would like to.
Oh, go ahead, Keith. Go ahead. Or Kevin.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, just very, very briefly as well, to jump off of what Jake was saying, with like how it's important as well to recognize the multifaceted possibilities that the CRC offers to youth. I was also very interested looking through it. There's a lot of recognition involved in the CRC, and there's a lot of recognizing the dignity and the legitimacy as well of youth voices involved in it. There's a lot, especially to do with, I saw media and the media awareness and such. And of course, young people are relatively media aware and media literate, I would say. So just recognizing as well, like that children have a right to access information, to access it freely, and to be able to speak their minds. I think not only is that really important to have, of course, in provisions, but I think having that as something that children, that young people can see, can help them understand as well that they have that right, and that they can understand in their own minds that they have some dignities, they have specific rights as well. But sorry, I don't want to interrupt Chris.
I just, the thing I really reinforce with my students is that this is a practical document, not a theoretical document. So like when we compare it to other documents from human rights that are often, like I said, like the UDHR, which are declarations, which are big, broad ideas, which then we narrow down to practice. This is a practical document. And so, you know, a document that can be used and implemented and enforced, right? And so I think that that concept is a really important one to reinforce with kids. And I don't know, I mean, just seeing where everybody's from on in the chat, but like, you know, with my students, I think they often look at many of them and say, well, those are rights that are protected for me. But then it leads to interesting conversations around like what might not be protected in other places and why it was necessary to include this in the document to make sure that it was protected for all kids, but then also that there are things that go on in this country like child marriage, which is actually an American problem. We do deal with that here, and that the ideas protected in the CRC are not over there ideas, but are, or, you know, right here ideas that are happening within the United States. So there are some practical conversations that happen there.
I want to go back to Article 29 and talk about it like on the youth level. So like the overall like idea of Article 29 is like the development of our mental and physical abilities to like our fullest potentials. And I think it supports a lot of like youth advocacy because it like promotes education and it empowers like young people to actively participate in society. And I think Article 29 is like a big push for like a more inclusive, diverse like education and like promoting like inclusiveness and like advocating for it from the youth level.
So what I'd like to just add is that Article 29 is in fact one of the articles that is problematic from the perspective of the United States. It was concerns over homeschooling and the prior right of parents to homeschool, which was one of the reasons why the CRC has never been ratified. But I think that the 12 rights of the child would be just a wonderful starting off point for a conversation in any classroom, even in a college-based classroom, because it invites a conversation both about rights and responsibilities. That, you know, on the one hand, a child has a right to protection from harm, but they also have a right to expect that someone is going to take care of them, that they have a right to that idea. They have a right to a separate identity and freedom of thought, a right to a family and privacy. But they're also, the assumption is that they're still not the kind of full human that can exercise the complete panoply of rights that adults are able to do. And so I think, I mean, at least from my perspective, the education dimension of the rights of the child are not just about one's education in terms of preparation for a career, but also a series of, you know, preparation for participation in civic life, where you can exercise your right to an opinion, preparation for a civic life where you know what your privacy is and how to protect it, right? That, you know, education here is also about how you can raise concerns about when your rights are being violated or the rights of others are being violated. So I think something that's really critical when you think about this, the way that starting with Article 26 and moving through the the economic, cultural, and social rights manifestation, the rights of the child and others, is that the United Nations human rights understanding of education is beyond pedagogy. It's beyond just books. It's about the formation of the human being. And I think it's important to think that, you know, even in 1948, that kind of that suggestion would not have been universally accepted, and certainly has a radical dimension even today. So though I do think I want to agree with Jenna on something. I think it's important to have a conversation about why the United States hasn't passed it and why it's so problematic. But also that conversation needs to include the fact that many of the rights that are outlined in the CRC are already rights that young humans have in the United States. However, the critical missing pieces are the anti-poverty, the right not to live in poverty, which is particularly important. So I'll stop there. I mean, we see this slightly differently on the collegiate level. And when we look at this, we're, I think, primarily moving people into adult advocacy roles, rather than necessarily imagining child advocacy. So in other words, that we're training our people to become advocates for children, not necessarily as children engaging in advocacy. That said, I've always been attracted, and I think Christy could speak more to this, which are the child-friendly cities initiatives and the voices of youth elements, which I think might be something that educators might be curious to learn more about. Sorry, Christy, I didn't want to make you do that. I mean, I did want to make you do that, but you're the expert here on that. So.
Well, I'm not sure if this is an appropriate time to just mention, or if it will come out in your conversations a little later. Should I? I mean, I'm happy to talk with anyone who wants to know more about the child-friendly cities. It has just been brought to the United States in the last 4 years. So Houston and Minneapolis, where I am, have been gone through the process of UNICEF's process of becoming a child-friendly city. And we're continuing to kind of re-up what does that look like for the next 2 years in terms of a plan of action. So even if you've kind of gone through a process that UNICEF has laid out, it's an ongoing kind of advocacy effort that we have to continue to work to try and realize. So it's an ongoing process, and many countries all over the world have really been much more kind of on the front end of becoming child-friendly cities, as well as having child-friendly schools. So I think we're all trying to figure out how we can be more effectively kind of putting these things into action, which is why this series is kind of upon us and why we're learning from you all about your advocacy work. So thank you.
Thank you, Christy, and everyone. All had some very interesting, really filling out that question with your responses. And on that note of advocacy, what is like the connection between youth rights and human rights advocacy? Some of you want to talk about that.
So a core idea in the CRC is that children can be and should be advocates for their rights. Right? So that's a really important basic theoretical assumption here, or theoretical idea, which is that when we talk about, you know, the best interest of the child, children engaged in consulting over what they want to do with their lives, that the CRC establishes that children should take a role in human rights advocacy. Not that they can, but that they should, at least to the point of advocating for their own basic rights. So they have that role, and can and should have that role. So that's, I would imagine, something that might be very interesting to talk about with young people in a high school setting, is just, how do you advocate for your own rights? How do you do that, right? How do you do that? I know my my children will often criticize me, and when they're really mad at me, they'll say, "And you call yourself a professor of human rights." But I don't think that's quite what the CRC meant. So that's one of the things I think we could imagine coming out of a conversation about youth advocacy in the CRC, is that this establishes that possibility, right? And again, I think it's important to note that the expectation that young people can be advocates is not universal, that this is something that we should be willing to acknowledge. I imagine that you could elaborate teaching plans about young people who have been human rights activists. There's great stories, of course, about Malala Yousafzai and oh goodness, the environmental activist that likes to sail boats. What is her name?
Greta.
Help me out, people. Greta Thunberg. Yeah. So that would be an area, I think, to think about, which is that CRC establishes that children can and should be human rights activists, right? That's one way to interpret it. I think the other would be to identify role models, right, internationally as well as within your community. Yeah, I see absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be engaged in such a way. I'm just thinking back to a generation ago where on high school campuses, Amnesty International chapters were almost universal. And that this is, I think, tells you something about Amnesty International and not about young people, but that Amnesty chapters are virtually non-existent anymore on high school campuses. And I know that human rights educators have been trying to do work on behalf of Human Rights Watch in LA and other places, drawing upon possible organizational collaborations. So those are, that would be my thought, some of my thoughts on this from sort of the collegiate side.
I certainly don't want to dominate the conversation. I've spoken a couple of times, so like, Jake or the other folks, feel free and cut me off. But I think something that I talk to my kids about is that in the study of human rights on a high school level, often we talk about these figures that are not from our communities, right? So you mentioned Malala and these other figures who kids, I think, see as preordained to greatness, right? So like, of course, Malala, or of course, Greta, or of course, these individuals who they read about, in American history, talk about like Martin Luther King, who, did these things. And one of the conversations I have with kids is that, like, these are not people who were born to greatness, right? Nobody, Malala wasn't born. It wasn't a huge celebration of her birth, right? Like, she was a kid who was born, and then, as her life unfolded, she ended up in a place where she was empowered enough by the people she was with to stand up for herself, right? So a lot of the things that in the various roles that I have in my high school is to give those levels of empowerment to kids on a very fundamental, basic level, so that when larger violations occur, they know how to speak with adults, what to say with adults, how to stand up for themselves, right? So I advise student government in my building, and there have been some issues over time with things like dress coding. That had been a fairly large conversation about what was going on in our building. And there are different policies that kids didn't like, and about how you speak with an administrative team who does not view you as somebody who should be part of that conversation, right? So I kind of personally don't believe that high schools are really built for kids. They're built for adults to kind of move kids through an educational experience, right? So like, teaching kids about, like, well, if you're unhappy about this, how you go about it, which isn't necessarily a fundamental human rights issue, right? Like, there are human rights issues around expression and culture and things that come with how you dress yourself for school, but I don't think kids see it that way. But I do think that they see this as something that's affecting them. And so teaching kids that adults aren't going to do this for you. So finding the advocates or the allies in your building, understanding how you go and find an adult or any person in power, right? So if you translate that to human rights advocacy, any person in power who will listen to you and help you along your way as an ally. And I think that those are ways that on a secondary level, certainly with high school students, but you can certainly work that backwards into middle school. And there are places where you can do it with even younger kids, that you teach how you recognize and how you speak with adults. And then, certainly I think Kevin could speak to it, and Jenna too, that like it's also about working as adults, creating environments where kids are empowered to make real meaningful decisions about what's going on, and not just what color will the prom tables be, right? So like, actually giving them environments where the decisions that are going to be made are actually real decisions like other people are going to see, right? And so as adults that work with kids, we need to recognize that as well, right? That this may not be going on at home, and so like we need to create those here. So I would just kind of share those insights.
And I think on the youth level, especially, becoming educated about your rights, because before ever coming into this class, I didn't learn about human rights. I wasn't aware of all the rights that we're entitled to us as children and on the youth level. And I think like I would have never learned about, like I did a project on the offensive representation of school mascots. Like I wouldn't have ever done something like that if I didn't become educated on the issue.
Yeah, and to jump off that point as well, with my own development of my own human rights knowledge throughout high school, in particular with Mr. Skripik here, Jake Skripik, we covered a lot of human rights, which I did not know at all before I came into that class, as Jenna was saying as well. And like, I realized through that class that not only are, of course, youth people, so of course their voices matter, but it's also even more, perhaps, in a sense, just them being youth gives them gives them a sense of criticality in them being able to voice their minds. Because with youth, well, in general, with human rights, it requires people who are conscious of diversity, who are like media literate, who are able to just understand, who are just well educated in general. And of course, that relies on youth in a sense, who can understand human rights, who can understand the power of their own empowerment. And so that just learning about human rights really taught me a lot about, yeah, just youth empowerment and human rights, and why it's important for children to recognize that.
I'll just weigh in with one quick point. I think something that Chris said stuck out to me about, this idea of authentically in real tangible ways, including and working shoulder to shoulder with young people in the furtherance of a school community, or in general, the fostering of a broader dignified community. And a lot of times we as adults say, yeah, young people, we can have you there and advise and consent, and yes, you've done your the good work, and go on your merry way. And that's not authentic. That's not real. That's not that's an advise and consent type of mantra. I think a lot of this, and it kind of heralds back a little bit to our conversation about the CRC. This is about mindset change on the power and the value that young people play in shaping our world around us. And I think that's the first step, right? Like, we can talk about the color of the tablecloths at prom all night. It's another thing to authentically say, we are going to take action in order to try and reframe how people think about young people, their value, their recognition, and their own seat at the table, as equal partners. And I think that is hard work. It's not easy. It takes a lot of shifting. But we can't keep going around the horn and just saying, yeah, we're going to bring youth in, and then they go on their merry way. I think that doesn't equate. We're going to still continue to have the same issues that we have had forever. So I just speak about that because I think that's a direction and a real deep shift that we have to make as a broader community.
Definitely. Thank you. In this next question, some of you have already kind of touched on it, which is, what are some examples of youth human rights activists? And you've already mentioned like Malala and Greta, and if there's any others, and what can we learn from them?
So I just put into the chat a link to a film, which I found to be very affecting, called Us Kids. And it was about the organized student response to the terrible shooting at Stoneman Douglas High. I think that this is probably an appropriate for sort of sophomore up level situation. It's a film that's told from the perspective of the young survivors of the shootings, including some who had been wounded and others. There are different responses. But what I think is important about it, at least from my perspective as a human rights educator, is that it discusses the nuts and bolts organizing of a movement. You know, how do you do that? And how do you build alliances, and how do you reach out? And then also, you know, a very critical moment where the students are confronted by the reality that, you know, their white privilege, the focus on this school, called upon them to really reach out, in particular to African American young people in a Chicago neighborhood that cumulatively was experiencing shootings in a way similar to what they experienced in just one day. So I think that films like, you know, there aren't a lot of films like this, but this one in particular, I think its focus on letting the young people themselves explain the process by which they organized, the trauma and difficulties that they faced both following the events, but then also the hassle and the abuse that they received on the road, is something worth thinking about. And again, I think I wouldn't show it to anyone younger than I wouldn't show it to anyone under sophomore year. I think that probably 15-year-olds would be just fine with this.
I kind of, to piggyback what Keith said, I put some links in the chat for RFK Human Rights, who I fully disclose work for. But they provide a number of resources for young people who are looking for stories about people who maybe are similar to themselves. So one of the links is specific about young youth defenders. In the second, or in the last one, is a defender series that they have. They're not all young people, but the middle one is a link to a project that RFK Human Rights sponsors, which is a video project. But if you look at some of the ones that have been submitted in the past, often kids are focused on local defenders who are either young people or work with young people. And it's a great way of youth advocacy for kids to feel empowered, kind of going back to the last question about how we empower young people. But this is something that RFK Human Rights does sponsor, and there are, you know, guidelines and things that you can look at. I do a version of the project where kids can do it if they would like, but a big part of advocacy is putting your name behind something and not standing, you know, in anonymity. And so this project is somewhere where you create something tangible and you submit it and you put your name on it, and it goes out into the rest of the world and somebody else can see it. And so so there are some resources there for either those who are interested, and again, I'm put my contact in the chat, but I'm happy to share with that anybody who's interested.
Thank you. And if people have other like resources and examples, feel free to put that in the chat. When we move to breakout rooms later, we'll have a document people can be putting resources in as well. So I want to transition us to our last question, although it has some subsets to it, which is, what are some best strategies for centering youth voices in human rights education and programming? And Jake and Chris, I know you do a lot of work in the classroom and with human rights close to home. So if you want to talk just a little bit about the work you do there.
Yeah, I can jump in, and then Chris, feel free to weigh in. You know, I think I'll say two things. One, I have a really kind of unique privilege to work in a school that requires human rights as a graduation requirement. And we put that in a number of years ago. It is something that we're very proud of, but we ask that all students take up this course experience. And you could be a student, you know, in the regular high school, 1,800 students. We have it at all at our alternative programs. Every student has to you know, graduate from Manchester Public Schools having taken this class, and we've really tried to put that into practice, that this is a valuable, meaningful experience that we very much care about as part of your trajectory as a student within our school, going off into the world, and trying to become that emerging citizen. So I'll just mention that that's kind of a core component of our programming. And then Chris, myself, Kevin have been involved in Human Rights Close to Home out of the University of Connecticut. Essentially, it is a 3-year program really trying to amplify human rights education and civic education with teachers and young people in the state of Connecticut. So there's multiple components to it. One component is teacher fellows and youth fellows in essentially a 2-year cycle, building curriculum for their classrooms on the teacher side, and then the youth fellows really developing civic action plans that they are going to implement in their school communities, all with this focus on not human rights out there, but really human rights close to home here in Connecticut, issues and topics that matter to us within our home community. And part of that broader program, Chris, Kevin, and I have been involved with, is the development of this one-day youth summit, really to bring a wider swath of high school students to the University of Connecticut campus to really engage in a number of workshops and sessions and speaker sessions dedicated to amplifying human rights education altogether. And it's been really fantastic. We've run it for a number of years. It's a program that we are trying to kind of build intersectionality and community within a small but mighty state of Connecticut. And I'll leave it over to Kevin or Chris to weigh in with anything.
I was just gonna say, go ahead, Kevin, because I think your insights, I do a lot of the same thing with Jake, so I just wanted to piggyback on that. But our group has a youth board that does a lot of the decision making, and Kevin was a big part of that for a really long time. So I think his insight into it would be really useful.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I was. It was such a privilege to be a youth advisor to the Human Rights Close to Home, the Youth Summit planning, and we worked a lot on like just basic logistics and so on to make this come together. We organized schedules for workshops and speakers, and it really was incredibly inspiring to be able to go to the Youth Summit and to have been a part of it, because we had, as Jake was mentioning, many students from across the state of Connecticut coming to UConn campus and hearing from speakers, say like a refugee from Afghanistan or people who helped resettle refugees and so much more. And just these really inspiring stories. But even more inspiring was just how many young people themselves were passionate and how they themselves were speaking up and just how much they were learning and how much they were engaged in it. And I think that was really special because human rights, sometimes, at least to me, it feels like sometimes a bit of a pessimistic field. There's just so much that like is really tricky, and there's so many difficulties and so much pain to achieve human rights. But to see so many young people coming together and just so engaged was really incredible, and it was such a great experience. And it really showed me just how important youth are, and we need to make sure that youth understand human rights because their voices are incredibly important and very unique. And that experience taught me a lot.
But one thing I would add to what Kevin was talking about too is that Connecticut, while Jake said it is a small but mighty state, we also are widely disparate in our diversity and economic background. So one of the interesting parts when we run this summit is that we are bringing kids from some of the wealthiest schools in the country that are in our state, and then some of the most impoverished schools in the country. And the way they talk about the same topic, access to different things. For the first time for a lot of kids, it's meeting people who are coming from very different backgrounds to talk and be solution oriented around these different issues. So the summit, I know, is really unique, and we're in a place in Connecticut where UConn is providing that as a resource for us, but it is replicable in other places. And, you know, again, like I think Jake and I and Kevin would be happy to speak to folks about if you're interested in something along those lines. But it is entirely run by kids. You know, really, Jake and I do things like pay for buses and food, and then the kids, you know, they do the vast majority of the work. And the other thing that I think is worth noting is that the class Jake referenced and the class that I teach is also a high school class that is given college credit by the University of Connecticut. So it's what's called an ECE course. So kids can get college credit in high school for taking this course as if they were sitting in the Storrs campus, UConn Storrs campus, which incentivizes kids to take the course. You know, I think every year my class is fairly full, and you know, I'm fully aware that kids are taking it because they're going to get college credit for it, but I don't care how they got into the room. Now they're in the room, right? And we're having that conversation and they leave, I think better, at least I hope better for it. Now, Jenna could tell you if she's better for it, but you know, it's a good experience, I think.
So first off, I think it's great that you guys have it required to take. I think it should be a class that's required to take, especially at our school. And then second, I went to that summit at UConn as a student in the class, and it was amazing to see like all of us talking within each other and a student leading a conversation among us all and running it, just like advocating. And my experience in the class in particular was an amazing experience. I got to learn so many different things. I got to learn about things like the opioid crisis and like sex trafficking and all of these things we don't talk about in any other class, but this class, which is why I think it's so important to take. And I think we need to, as a society, especially now, to be more educated and to make change. And we're the future, and we need to be educated to advocate for our rights and to stand up for beliefs and all of these things. And this class was perfect for learning about all of that.
Thank you. And then as we're wrapping up here, one last quick kind of question or direction of the same question. Keith, did you want to talk some about the work you're doing at UC Davis, centering kind of youth voices and human rights, especially maybe talking about the backpack guide training badge you're working on?
Sure. At UC Davis, we administer a worldwide tool, ecosystem, we like to call it, for refugee university students to safely store, curate, share, protect their most valuable educational documents and research. And, you know, it's like 5,000 people around the world use it, but it's a project that's been largely administered by young people. In fact, I need to step off this meeting now and go to that meeting. But we developed we're becoming very interested in the use of micro-credentials and badging. And I know that's not as appropriate for high school students, but it's certainly something we've been going to think about for even human rights education. But I'm going to put the link here for the badge training itself. We're always encouraging people to do it, and it's a really good way to learn more about backpack. I just want to just sort of on the side note here, I just want to tell you how much I admire the work that's being done in Connecticut, and how far advanced you are compared to what we've been able to accomplish out here in California, where, you know, human rights sort of as a tool, as a philosophy, as a way to range the world gets a few mentions at the end of the Second World War in junior level history classes and then disappears. So that doesn't mean there aren't plenty of California-based educators who are working really hard. It's just that it's, you know, the what Connecticut has been able to do in this case is really outstanding, and I think a great model for what can and should be done across the rest of the United States. So I'm looking forward to future TAASs, and again, thank you all very much. Christy, it's always wonderful to see you. And I will talk to you all soon. And Kara, thank you for organizing this and including us. All right,
Thank
bye
you.
now.
So now, before we get into our breakout rooms, we have a few minutes if anyone has any questions for the panelists. or questions for the whole group?
Hello. Hi. I don't know if anyone can hear me, but I have a question. Oh, perfect. Yeah. My name is Alda. I'm a master's student here in Columbia University. My question would be, so there is a overlapping age between children and young people, where usually young people are defined as 15 to 24, while children are under 18. But I think oftentimes in a forum or event that related to youth, for example, like this year we have the Summit of the Future, and we have 2 days specifically for Youth Action Days. And in those forum, like children are being excluded, or like person under 18 are being excluded for the reason of safeguarding. So my first question would be like, what is your thought about like the exclusion of children in event related to young people while they're being excluded because of the reason of safeguarding protection? And my second question would be like, I think oftentimes the engagement with young people can be very tokenistic in terms of like they are being bring into the table and they are here, but the decision power are still within the adult. So it's almost like you're just there to confirm, like if you're giving ideas and then the adult agree to the idea, then the idea will be like made into the next step. But like if the adult don't agree to the idea, for example, like it will not be continued. So it's even when children are being excluded in being included in the table, I think the decision power often are still being held in the hands of the adults. So I think my question would be like, how do we switch this power and give more a decision power to the children or young people? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'll weigh in. I think I'll take the second question. I think that, I mean, it's a deep question that we have to kind of reckon with in all of our, particularly our educational spaces. I think it really does take, as I said before, a conscious effort on adults to willingly and actively change our mindsets around the value of a young person in the design and the fostering of a community. So I'll give you one example that I think is actually a positive example. Our school has gone through about 7 or 8 years of a school reform grant that we've had through a foundation up in Boston. And there's been a number of changes we've done in terms of our objectives for our portrait of our graduate and our graduation requirements. And we've kind of unplugged the school and plugged it back in. And all along the way, consciously, young people have been at the table, not just in an advised consent role, but at the heart of that redesign of our school. And I think that takes intentional shifts that actually really takes strong leadership on the part of a school or even a community space to say, this is the direction that we are going to go. We believe in having young people working shoulder to shoulder authentically with adults, and doing it in a way that is safe, is inclusive, and is respectful to both adult and young person's needs. I also think that adults, if that mindset change is going to happen, need models, because it's very, very easy just to default and say, hey, we're going to bring Kevin in and we love his thoughts and he'll be in for an hour meeting and then again on his way, and we don't do anything with him afterwards. I do think for adults to change their mindset, they need to see that, yes, it can work and it can be beneficial. And it takes a little bit of courage too. It takes a little bit of bold risk taking to step out there and say, yeah, we're going to authentically have young people as equal partners in whatever the work that we might be doing. So I don't think it's an easy task. And I think your question is very complex, but it's something that we have to have the courage to do. Otherwise, again, we'll continue to kind of spin our wheels around these similar issues.
Just to piggyback on that, all that, I think to the first part of your question around like the idea of like safety and like why people are excluded on that level, right? So at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about like the United States not ratifying the CRC. And one of the arguments that was used around that is that we would be giving rights to children that they were not cognitively or developmentally appropriate to have, right? Like it's as if like by signing the CRC, we were just going to be like giving, 3-year-olds all these rights that they should not have. And it's an overblowing and an oversimplification of what the CRC is and about what empowerment of kids is, right? So like we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We're not saying like, so the idea is that when when these events are structured or when you put something together, it's at the developmental level that's appropriate for the age of the children that you're dealing with, right? So, in my human rights class, we talk about the fact that you can teach human rights and very complex human rights to elementary age kids. Like, in fact, they're often better at this than high school kids are, right? Because they understand sharing and empathy and caring and all of these things that are core human rights philosophies. Elementary age kids, it's part of their curriculum. But in high school, we that there's so many other factors, but that it needs to be scaffolded in. So like, you can include a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old in a panel discussion like this, on a different level than you would for an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old, although you could include an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old here, as long as you are putting certain safeguards in place and making sure that their parents are involved or their guardian is involved, or that there's somebody looking out for the interests of a child, right? So I think to what Jake's point is that it's used as a convenient excuse, because it does take work, and it does take, like when Jake and I run these things at UConn, the amount of child protective things we have to go through in order to host something is massive. But we are dealing with other people's children, and it's a pain. I'm not gonna lie, like Jake would agree. I mean, like it is so much bureaucracy that kind of gets in the way of good work, but we're trying to protect kids at the same time. And if you're not willing to do that, it's much easier to run this event if we don't have kids do this, right? So I think that it's often an excuse by people who are very well-meaning, by the way, that they just don't want to have to do those extra steps that would actually empower kids. And other than working to make a climate shift in your community, which is good, deliberate work, it's a kind of a fact that, as with any other human rights task, needs to be addressed and kind of culturally worked in.
Yeah, just to jump in very quickly with Chris's points there. Something that struck me was about just how you were talking about how important youth voices are, and that like they cannot be disregarded just because of their youth. And of course, I can't say I'm well aware of the bureaucracy involved or anything of that, the logistics and all that. But I do think that it is critical to recognize just that a value that kids aren't like teaching human rights to kids isn't just like kids aren't just like a time to teach them human rights. I think that's a critical opportunity when people are kids, when you are kids, to be able to learn and to be able to speak. Because as Chris was mentioning, like younger people can have so much valuable insight and unique perspectives on things. I think it's a great opportunity, and not just a time to have them speak. I think that's just a really important value to understand.
Thank you. We're going to start moving into our breakout session. If people do have questions, you can put that in the chat. There will also be a survey at the end that you can put questions in that as well. We might have some time before we end the session for some more questions too. So if you have them, still send them our way and we'll try and get them you answers. So now, I was looking at the chat. We're going to move into breakouts. We're going to have about one panelist in each of these sessions. We're really wanting this to be a time where you can talk to each other and kind of brainstorm and strategize ways that you can be empowering youth in your own communities, and have about 10 minutes in there. We'll reconvene as a large group at 8:17. There is a notes document I just shared in the chat. It has some basic instructions for the breakout rooms and a place where you can put notes. So if you have resources and ideas, they can go there, and then we can all kind of see what you're coming up with so we can learn from each other. Christy, we do have you in a breakout room that Keith was originally going to be in, so can help moderate that a little bit. So we will see you soon. Jarwin, if you want to send us on our way.
Yes, just a minute. Thanks for all your sharing experiences. Yes, I think. So for the panelists, please, I have just, I think, advise you to join the breakout rooms, and for the other participants, just wait a second. I will distribute you to the breakout rooms. See you soon. Da, da. Yeah, you are the only group that finished, actually. Nice to see you back. Kara, sure, handle the access to you.
I think this might be everyone now. Great. So I know those conversations might have felt a little cut short. If you do have more ideas and resources, continue to add those to the document after the session too, and you all have access to that. Hopefully it can be a resource. So now we have a few minutes if people want to just briefly recap what you talked about, starting with group 1.
Yes. Hi, my name is Mireya. Just like a little bit background for me, I'm getting my major in criminal justice, so my thought process was more criminal justice. So one thing that we had said like was hear from others, wellness checks and recognition of health and youth welfare, buddy systems. So one of the things we talked about was, because my criminal justice is like the school to prison pipeline kind of deal, and so we just kind of talked about that and how we could empower those youth, and just being able to have discussions, and mandatory classes just so that we know who we are, I guess, in this world. And I feel like the younger you are to know that, you have a better sense of self. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Group 2, do you want to share out?
Sorry, I was getting my unmute. Yes, absolutely. We had a really good conversation about really kind of giving students the tools to see themselves in the role as advocates. And so we talked about that, yeah, you know, in our home communities, we might have X, Y, and Z issue, but that our things like our right to education and our right to learn are being violated in other places around the world. And if we can take example and really use that as a positive attribute to do good work in our home communities, that's something that can kind of sustain and really fulfill students, making really school a more enjoyable place to be. We also talked about, you know, having honest, open, authentic conversations with students, you know, really not treating them as robots, but having those very human conversations about what do you care about, what rights do you feel like are important for you, and how can we continue to foster a broader culture of dignity. And then we talked about a little bit of just having authentic media literacy as well, really making sure that students are informed and can kind of parse through what is disinformation and misinformation and what is true fact before us. So a little bit here, I think we could have gone on with the conversation, but it was a really, really powerful conversation.
I'm glad. Thank you. Group 3.
That might have been us. I'm not 100% sure if we were group 3 or not. No? Okay, Tia says we weren't, so I'm not going to.
Jenna, I think that might have been us. Are you able to do the summary?
Yeah. So the basis of our conversation was pretty much about becoming educated and promoting the education of human rights and helping the youth become aware of their fundamental rights. And we like came up with ideas of like balancing our education, because as one of the women Elizabeth was talking about, she leads like youth-led groups and stuff, and she has these children who are very like unengaged with it because they're teenagers, and and talked about like balancing it with like more fun and not making things so pessimistic, and engaging them and making it more personal to them, and making it inclusive. And then we talked about mentorship and guidance, and connecting like the youth with members, mentors, and other people, and like coinciding and talking and just having conversation, and leadership as well.
Thank you. Now, Chris, if your group wants to share out.
It doesn't have to be me. If one of you guys want to do it, I can, but
I mean, a recap of our conversation was really me just trying to probe Chris's brain about how they got this launched in Connecticut and what that process looked like. It's because I would really love to know bits and pieces that we can, be replicated rather easily. Some major takeaways for me, I would say, is first look for pieces of the existing curriculum or standards in your district and compile those so that you're not having to recreate anything. You're just simply using what the district already has so that you can then call it this specific human rights lens of class. Another thing is that while I think that maybe something that I get worried about is the bureaucratic side of it and having to show different growth and measurement, both quantitative and qualitative. But I think in this case, what we have discussed is that we really need to hone in on the idea of this like qualitative I guess, improvement or increased engagement that we're going to see from our students. And I think that, because we were talking about the importance of social and emotional learning and how that ties into this, the coursework of human rights practice. And so if we're able to take it to our district and not only on an academic side of things, prove why this should be a required course, but also on the social, emotional, and learning development side of things, I think that we're really hitting all nails on the head. I don't know where I was going with that last bit, but that was my takeaway from it. I thought that it could be a really great conversation. I might be working on a capstone in my master's soon, and I think that maybe even trying to lay out what this process could look like for other teachers and districts, maybe working along some of the lines that some of you have already set up, could be a really cool way of going about it, or at least doing more research about it.
I'm going to jump
Great.
in if it's
Yeah,
all right,
okay.
Cara.
Yes.
To just say, Danielle, it would be wonderful to be in touch if you want to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat, but Jake and a few people are pulling together right now some models for human rights social studies standards. And I think there's some initiatives of trying to figure out how we can strategically think about doing this work. So thanks.
Yes, and I just put a link to a survey in the chat. That is another place if you have questions and you want to get more involved, you can do that through there. You can learn more about Human Rights Educators USA at hrusa.org. It's the website. If that's wrong, you can just look up Human Rights Educators USA and it should be the first thing to pop up. So thank you so much for coming today. I'll be on a few minutes later if people do have questions. Again, please fill out that survey. Even if you don't have questions, that's really helpful information for us to have and keep track of. And so have a really great night, and thanks again for coming.
Christy, I would really, really love to